Hi, everybody. Are we letting people in, Dan? People are coming in. Hi,
Yeah.
everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We are going to start in a couple of minutes. As you come in, if you want to drop your name and where you're from in the chat, we want to sort of get a look at where everybody's coming from. It's so fun. I love seeing where people are coming from. Wow, excellent. Cool. I guess we'll wait a couple minutes. Let people roll in. Richmond, Virginia. Wow. Seattle. Cool. I guess we can start with introductions and stuff. Ready? Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Louise Washer. I am with the Pollinator Pathway, and I'm going to be moderating tonight's presentation. I'm just going to put in a little plug for the Pollinator Pathway. If you're not familiar with our organization, check it out. The website is pollinator-pathway.org. I'll stick it in the chat. We're a grassroots organization committed to helping restore safe, connected, pesticide-free habitat for pollinators. And before we start our talk tonight, I'm going to just go through a couple of housekeeping things. You'll notice everybody's mics are muted and everybody's cameras off. That's intentional. We do want to hear from everybody. If you're just joining, we'd love to hear your name and where you're from, any organization you're associated with, so we can get a sense of where everyone's coming from. And but after that, I think as we get going, we're going to turn the chat off, and then we're going to ask you to put your questions in the Q&A. You can put questions in all during the talk, and then at the end of the talk, Lena is going to moderate those questions, and we'll have a question and Q&A part of the conversation. So today's the other housekeeping, today's discussion is going to be recorded. So if you have to leave early, or if you want to share this with a friend, I think we're going to be sending the link out to everyone who registered. That's the plan. That's the goal. But it will also be posted on the Pollinator Pathway website, which I am going to stick that in the chat for people. And the other thing, so I guess that's all for housekeeping. I hope I didn't miss anything, you guys. I'm going to introduce our speakers. I'm really honored and excited to introduce Dan Rochelle, Acting Director of the Natural Resource Defense Council's Pollinator Initiative, which focuses on protecting our nation's bee populations from ever-growing threats to their health and existence, in particular the use of bee-toxic pesticides. Rochelle was formerly co-director of NRDC's Community Fracking Defense Project and an advocate of the cleanup of industrial pollution in the New York region. So I'm going to let Dan take it away in a minute, but I'm going to also introduce Dr. Kathleen Nolan, pediatrician, president of the Physicians for Social Responsibility New York chapter, senior research director at Catskill Mountain Keeper. Over the past 3 decades as a doctor and bioethicist, she has served Ulster County in the Catskills by focusing on public health and the environment, playing an important role in achieving New York State's pioneering ban on fracking by helping to compile and provide data on health harms associated with practice to decision makers. So welcome to everybody, and welcome to you both. And Dan, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, so I'm going to try and share my screen here and start the slideshow. So I think that worked. Can everybody see that? Great. So as mentioned, my name is Dan Rochelle. I'm Acting Director of NRDC's Pollinator Initiative, and I'm here today to talk about neonicotinoid pesticides, or neonics for short, and the threats that they pose to bees, birds, ecosystems, and human health. I'll let folks know, because we have folks from all over the country, that some of the slides here are going to focus on New York specific material because we have a big campaign there, but all of the material should be relevant to what's going on nationwide. So to kick things off, and I know I don't need to belabor this point to this crowd, but pollinators are important. So 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we take comes from pollination provided by pollinators. And to give you a sense of what that looks like, here is a grocery store aisle in our current world, a world with bees and other pollinators. Here's what that grocery store would look like in a world without those pollinators. So certainly we would still have food. We would just have a lot less of it. We would have a lot fewer choices, especially losing some of our most delicious and nutritious foods. And it would all be much more expensive. Beyond just the grocery store aisle, we know pollinators are absolutely essential for ecosystems. They're necessary for about 80% of the plant species on the face of the earth to reproduce. So if we lose pollinators, we worry not only about food security issues, but ecosystem collapse. And effectively, that's what we are worried about. So about 20 years ago, beekeepers in New York, Connecticut, and across the country started seeing their annual losses of honeybee colonies shoot through the roof, going from about 10, 15% losses per year to 30, 40, 50% virtually overnight. And those losses have persisted to this day, maintaining near those record high levels. And while honeybees are essentially livestock and they're bred and replaced every year, so we're able to maintain the number of colonies in the US through that sort of furious breeding and replacement program, we know the same is not true for our native pollinators. And this is a study from New York, but it would be probably similar across the country. A survey that came out last summer finding that 40 to 60% of the native pollinating species there are at risk of local extinction. And that's a huge number. And again, I don't need to stress the importance to this crowd, but that's a big problem for ecosystems. It's also a big problem for food production. So this is a study that came out a couple of years ago, finding that apple, blueberry, and cherry crops across the nation are pollinator limited, which means farmers are already growing fewer of those products because we don't have enough bees and other pollinators, and especially wild bees. We can't rely on honeybees, and especially those populations are getting weaker and prone to collapse from sort of this year after year, die-offs and rebreeding. So that's the situation with pollinators. Why are we here to talk about pesticides and why specifically neonic pesticides? We know there are a lot of problems for pollinators. There's climate change, there's habitat loss, there's parasites, pathogens. Why pesticides? Why neonics? It's helpful first to sort of introduce neonics and what they are. So neonics are neurotoxic insecticides, meaning they are pesticides designed to kill insects by attacking their nerves. And they do so by binding to those nerves irreversibly, permanently binding to those nerves and overstimulating them until they ultimately die. So if you've seen a bee that has been acutely poisoned with neonics, they'll usually start to shake uncontrollably and then become paralyzed and die. But again, a lot of pesticides kill bees and other insects in gruesome ways. Why do we care about neonics in particular? There are 3 main reasons. The first is that neonics are super duper toxic to bees and other insects. And to give you a sense of scale here, just 1 neonic treated corn seed has enough active ingredient to kill 250,000 bees or more. And in fact, neonics have made US agriculture 48 times more harmful to insect life since their introduction. And if you look at where that spike in harmfulness happens, it's almost exactly at the same time that we see this massive spike in losses of honeybee colonies across the country. And it's also when we see neonics starting to be used on corn and soybean seeds. And I'll explain that in a minute. Second problem with neonics is that they're so good at contaminating whole ecosystems. So they're designed to permeate plants, to get into the leaves, the roots, the pollen, the nectar, everything. and effectively to make the plant itself toxic to insects, to make the plant itself the pesticide. And that means they can be applied in all sorts of interesting ways. So they can definitely be sprayed, and they are, like older conventional insecticides, but they can also be applied directly to soil, or most commonly, painted on a crop seed. And here's a picture of some neonic-treated corn seed. Here's a close-up of some corn seed. They don't always pick the same color. And the idea is that as that seed is growing into a plant, it literally soaks up the pesticides through its roots and becomes toxic. The problem is only 2 to 5% of that pesticide coating actually get into the plant that they're supposed to be targeting. Some is released as in these toxic clouds of dust during planting, but most of it stays in the soil where it persists for years. And those same properties that let the neonics get up into the target plants, namely that they're really mobile in water, means that anytime it rains, anytime there's irrigation, lawn watering, those neonics are moving through the soil, contaminating new soil. If there are plants in that soil, those plants soak up the pesticides, they become toxic. If there's a water supply nearby, that water supply becomes polluted. Third problem with neonics is that they are just all over the place. They are the most popular insecticides in the United States. They're all over agricultural production. And to give you a sense here, just about every conventional corn seed in the United States is pre-treated with a neonic before planting. That's somewhere between 90 and 100 million acres, about 5% of the land area of the lower 48 states. But neonics are also off the farm as well. They're all over lawns, gardens, golf courses, you name it. And in those non-agricultural spaces, actually neonics are permitted and used at rates that are much higher per acre than in agriculture. So this just gives you a sense of neonic use in New York. It's probably very similar across the country. And I'll bring folks' attention to this red square here. That is the use of imidacloprid. So it's one of the more used neonics, but certainly not the most used, not even in New York. And here is a picture of how imidacloprid use has grown over the years. And I know 2014 is not the most recent year, but it's the most recent year where we have data on both the seed treatments and the other uses, and the seed treatments being a really big use. So it's the last year we have good data for. And what you see is that this is just the use of one of 5 EPA-approved major neonics. It's not even the most used, and this is just agricultural areas. So a lot of those white areas that you see around urban areas, around Long Island, in Connecticut, Chicago, urban areas of the West Coast, those areas would be filled in if they were counting non-agricultural uses, and again, other neonics as well. So what this gives you a sense of, though, is that we have a situation where these pesticides are being used year after year after year in the same places. They persist in the soil for years, right? So every year that they're being used in the same place, there's a buildup of toxicity in the soil. And then that's spreading out every time it rains, every time there's lawn watering, every time there's irrigation. So that's sort of the scope of the problem. What we have now is ubiquitous contamination of our environment with these pesticides, soil, water, plant life, over huge areas of the country, including the places where people live. So we see that in the water. USGS testing finds neonics in about half of streams nationwide, but that's probably an underestimate because if you test at different points in the year, you're more likely to see more and more of those hits. But we're already seeing neonics in about half of streams nationwide. Most of the testing that's being done by various departments of the environment are just testing for imidacloprid, again, just that one and not even the most used neonic. All of the levels that we're seeing, or just about all of the detections, are at levels that are above EPA's benchmark for harms to aquatic ecosystems. So there's a very high probability that that's having ecosystem-wide damage. And it's worth noting for our New York audience that neonics are all over New York surface waters, and they're the most commonly detected insecticide in a Long Island aquifer. Also worth noting that conventional chlorination treatment doesn't remove neonics from water supplies. So what's the effect of this, right? We have this massive contamination across our environment, across our ecosystems. What effect is that having in the real world? The first that we know is absolutely confirmed is that neonics are driving bee and pollinator losses nationwide. That's not just honeybees, it's the 400 plus species of wild bees in New York, it's the 4,000 plus species of wild bees across North America, not to mention other pollinating insects and insects at large. Really what's happening is we're hollowing out the ecosystem from the bottom up. And the anecdote that I like to relate to people is, imagine, for those of us who remember, driving around a rural area in the 1990s during summer. You'd have to turn your windshield wipers on, whether or not it was raining, just to get all of the bugs off of your windshield, and think to yourself, when is the last time you really had to do that? And that's sort of the most visible aspect of this issue. We're seeing a hollowing out of our ecosystems right in front of our eyes. And I think for a lot of us, we're missing it. So as you might imagine, that has impacts across ecosystems. And we see that especially with birds. So there's a lot of studies now connecting losses of birds, losses of bird biodiversity directly to neonics. And unsurprisingly, these are the insect-eating birds. There was another study that was done by Cornell a couple of years ago. I don't know if folks remember, finding that over the last 50 years, we've lost 30% of our birds in North America. Well, another group of researchers came in after that and did a separate study, just looking at the data from the original study and saying, well, hey, let's tease out the species that rely on insects for their diet versus the birds that don't rely on insects. And we find some interesting numbers. The birds that don't rely on insects are actually doing kind of okay, and maybe even slightly increased in numbers during that time. But the birds that rely on insects as a diet are absolutely hammered. And so that's another face of what we're seeing with neonic pollution. Birds are not the only one. Neonics also affect aquatic ecosystems. As you imagine, these toxic pesticides, the sort of the organisms in these aquatic ecosystems are literally bathing in them. And this was a study that was done in Japan a couple of years ago. Researchers there were looking at zooplankton. And then for folks who want to see what zooplankton are, these are zooplankton. They're sort of water bugs or water invertebrates. And what they found is that, you know, in the early 90s, all of a sudden the zooplankton populations just hit a wall, right? And just fell off a cliff, essentially. And unsurprisingly, the fish that ate those species also fell off a cliff because they had no more food. And there was confusion for a while, you know, what was the cause of this sudden drop off? But the study authors later connected it to the introduction of neonics in nearby agriculture. And it's worth noting that the levels that we saw in the water there later measured match a lot of the water levels that we see in New York and across the country. So I'm going to hand it off to Kathy in just a bit, but it's not just indirect impacts that we see from these pesticides. There are direct impacts to animals that have spines, including birds. And this is from a study a couple of years ago, finding that neonic exposure interferes with bird migration. Just one neonic-coated corn seed has enough active ingredient to kill a small songbird, and birds definitely eat these seeds during planting. But even at levels that don't kill birds, they harm their neurological functions, their reproductive functions, so that even if that bird doesn't die at that moment, it may not be able to survive in the wild, it may not be able to reproduce, and so that can lead ultimately to the death of the bird or death of that population. And here is where I'll hand it off to Dr. Nolan.
Thank you, Dan. I want to start by emphasizing that the insecticides that we're talking about here are called neonicotinoids. And what that means, those syllables mean, is new nicotine-like compounds. So what Dan has been saying about the presence in the environment and the harms we've discussed so far really shouldn't be too surprising. If you look at the chemical structure here, these compounds are very similar to nicotine. And the way that a bee exposed to a neonicotinoid dies is very similar to the way that almost any organism will die if acutely exposed to nicotine. So this is from the basic chemical structure and pharmacology, we should be worried about these particular compounds. And nicotine should be decreasing in our environment, not increasing. So the next slide shows a headline from a couple of years ago. As pesticide turns up in more places, safety concerns mount. And the pesticides they're talking about there are the neonics. The more places, they're not talking just about geography, they're talking about more different kinds of living beings. And in terms of pollinators, we have birds, but we also have bats. And so we have seen declines in bat populations, some of which can be linked to similar types of exposures. So there's one of the first mammals in the wild that is showing up with potentially having problems from neonics. But bats consume huge quantities of insects. So we might think, okay, they're just getting the neonic exposure because they are eating these insects that have been exposed to the neonics. It's a little harder to tease out whether they're having direct harmful impact. But a series of studies now from the West, Wyoming and other states in the West and Montana, are showing that large mammals, the white-tailed deer in particular, are having impacts that appear to be directly related to neonic toxicity. So this research started because hunters were observing jaw malformations in deer that they were hunting, and also abnormalities of the genitalia. So a group of researchers in South Dakota decided to study this and took deer in pens outdoors in the wild and gave them different doses of neonics in their water. They were in pens, so they weren't wandering around, but that was to make sure that the deer were getting the dose that the researchers were prescribing. One of the startling findings was that even the control group, which did not have any neonicotinoids added to the water by the researchers, still showed high levels of neonics in the deer's blood. So there's baseline exposure. They didn't actually have truly a control group that was not exposed. And they showed decreased survival in the deer, decreased activity, decreased size of offspring and health, immune suppression, and these were dose related. The larger the dose, the more they saw these effects. And they began to raise the question, is this now accumulating in deer populations through their exposures to crops? One of the studies in 2019 detailed the deformed jaw as one of the congenital abnormalities that was consistently seen in the deer that were more highly exposed, and decreased weight to the body organs. There was also a higher incidence of hypothyroidism, which the thyroid hormone is necessary for normal growth, lethargy, and fawns were dying instead of surviving at birth. These findings that were done in a more controlled study prompted other researchers to look for how widely prevalent neonics were in the environment. And a study from Minnesota showed in 2019, 61% of deer had levels that were above those associated with birth defects and the higher rates of death for fawns in the controlled study. And A third of those that were found were above those levels where you would expect to see these abnormalities in reproduction and in survival. And in 2021, those numbers had increased so that almost all deer were found to have some level of neonics in their blood and organs. It was primarily done through organs in those studies. And 2/3 were at these higher levels. So much more prevalent in the wild deer population and at much higher levels. So why should we be concerned? Well, animal studies, especially mammalian studies, are one of the ways that we anticipate whether there will be effects in humans. And I should mention that laboratory studies of mice and rats also show abnormalities that are in the same realm. That's a whole other field, so we won't talk too much about that tonight. But these studies, particularly these findings in wild deer, are very, very troubling, and especially in the context of how widespread the killing activity of neonics is. So, as I mentioned, in humans, we can see acute toxicity to exposure to these compounds that looks almost identical to acute exposure to nicotine. It's hyperactivity, jitteriness, muscle spasms, seizures, and potentially death. Chronic toxicity is harder to evaluate. You can't acutely expose people to these compounds, but that happens sometimes, and they come in and seek emergency medical care. To study chronic exposures to neonics requires doing what's called a case control study. You can't purposefully expose one group of people to neonics and leave another group unexposed, but you can look for situations in which there's high exposure and then compare what happens with that group with another group that doesn't have that exposure. And those studies have been done in a few instances, just 3 or 4, but they've been very troubling, what has been called suggestive findings. I think they're red flag findings. 4 studies reported associations between chronic exposure and adverse developmental or neurologic outcomes, including tetralogy of Fallot, which is a congenital heart defect, anencephaly, which is an extremely severe neurologic congenital defect, basically the birth of a child with the absence of the brain above the spinal cord, autism spectrum disorder, and there was a cluster of symptoms including memory loss and finger tremor. Of course, memory loss and finger tremor consistent with the acute toxicity studies. This finding in a few research studies is extremely troubling because the Centers for Disease Control have found that half of Americans are exposed to neonics. Anytime you test, you can find that. And a study of pregnant women found that 94% of them also had neonics in their blood, very similar to the numbers we're finding in wild deer. And over the course of the study, more women were found, a higher percentage of women were found to have neonics, and the levels were higher, just like we're also seeing in the wild animal studies. So there also have been some more recent studies that have linked neonic exposure to decreased sperm quantity and quality and decreased levels of testosterone, which as an important hormone for humans, affects insulin regulation and also fat metabolism. So these compounds are in the environment, and we have every reason to believe that they are extremely harmful to humans. My colleague and friend, Dr. Phil Landrigan, wrote an op-ed piece about this in which he compared the lead industry and its efforts to avoid taking responsibility for what researchers were finding to be harms from lead exposure to the chemical industry in its efforts to deny that neonics would have these kinds of impacts. And what we know about lead exposure is that there's no safe level really for lead exposure. Down to the lowest levels that we can measure, you can see some harmful impacts, and at extremely small levels of exposure, you can have harmful impacts. It appears that neonics are entirely analogous to lead, and we need to have the same kind of approach to getting neonics out of our environment as we have mostly successfully done with lead. And the effort to do that is part of what has motivated me to be involved in the work we're doing in New York State. I am hoping that it will be like fracking, that in New York State, we were able to take successful action and ban fracking activities, even though we have oil and gas bearing shale in New York State. And once one place does that, then others can follow. I believe we need to have the same kind of effort to have leading states show that we can take neonics out of the environment, especially in relationship to these coated seeds, and then have other places follow so that we remove this from the United States as a whole. I'll stop there, Dan, and maybe you can talk about what we can do to deal with this problem.
Yeah, I think we can, and that was fantastic. And I think that, you know, just to sort of, I think it really summarizes sort of the full scope of the problem that we're seeing. And so the question is, you know, what are folks doing about that problem? Well, the European Union several years ago banned the most used neonics over there, outdoor uses of those products, pretty much everywhere. And Canada has also imposed some pretty significant restrictions on neonic use, with Quebec and Ontario essentially phasing them out of corn and soybean seeds. And again, that's by far the largest and most widespread use. In the United States, there's been less action at the federal level. So the most recent decision comes from the Trump era EPA, essentially allowing neonic use sort of business as usual. EPA is going to revisit those decisions in the spring. They're going to issue some new proposed decisions on sort of what to do with neonics and new findings on what risks they pose. But EPA historically has been pretty soft on pesticides, even pesticides that we know are extremely harmful to the environment and even to children's health. And we saw that with chlorpyrifos and other insecticides that they only acted upon when they were sued and forced to by the courts. So it's also worth noting that EPA doesn't directly regulate neonic treated seeds, which is a big issue for states and also at the federal government. So it's really up to the states to take action, and states are beginning to take action. So New Jersey and Maine recently banned neonic use on non-agricultural landscapes, and those are states that don't have a lot of corn and soybean seeds. So it actually represents the vast bulk of neonics that are entering the environment in those states. Other states have taken action. Connecticut, Maryland, New York, Massachusetts, and Vermont have all effectively made neonics restricted use pesticides, which is a good first step. It basically takes those pesticides off of the store shelves at Home Depot, but it doesn't affect the neonic treated seeds, which is, again, is the most widespread use. And it doesn't affect use by landscapers, which we know is a huge, huge use. Also, it's worth noting that the problem with neonics is not that they're being misused, right? It's not that people aren't reading the labels and applying them wrongly. The problem is that the labels allow these toxic impacts that are affecting our environment and likely threatening our health. So just to talk a little bit about the work that's going on in New York, and I'll pass it to Louise in a second to talk about Connecticut. But we're working on a bill there that would be sort of a leading bill in the nation in terms of reducing neonic use. It's based on a major report done by Cornell University that looked at over 1,100 peer-reviewed papers, basically everything that had been written on neonics and pollinators to date. It didn't look at some of these other impacts, water and human health. but it did look at pollinators, and it found two important things: that two uses that were really problematic for pollinators also didn't provide a lot of benefits. And that were the neonic treated corn, soybean, and wheat seeds, which it found posed substantial risk to pollinators, but provided no overall net income benefit to farmers. So a huge use, widespread use, not providing any economic income benefits to farmers. And the second is the turf and ornamental uses, so the lawn and garden uses. In most cases, these uses also weren't providing benefits, so the neonics were being used prophylactically, sort of like taking a big dose of antibiotics at the beginning of the year, just in case you might get sick in 6 months. So in most cases, they were treating for pests that just didn't exist. But even in those cases where you would want to use an insecticide, there were other management practices and other insecticides that were much less harmful to the environment and still just as effective or more effective. So the bill targets just those two uses, just the seeds and the lawn and garden uses. It doesn't affect any other agricultural uses. It doesn't even affect other uses in corn and soybean. So if a corn farmer wants to spray neonics, the bill doesn't affect that. But nonetheless, it would get rid of 80 to 90% of the neonics going into New York's environment. And again, these are uses that just across the border in Canada, they're no longer using effectively neonics on these seeds. There's no reason that they should do so in New York because they are not providing those economic benefits. Other details in the bill also allows for treatment for invasive species as sort of a small exception there. And there's other exceptions in the bill to sort of ensure that when it goes into effect, that farmers won't be out of luck if they can't find non-neonic treated seed. And so with that, what happened to the bill? So this past session, it passed in the Assembly in New York State, which is great. It passed by an overwhelming margin. Unfortunately, the bill did not get a vote in the state Senate, even though it had passed in that state Senate the year previous by a vote of 43 to 20. So we think that next year the bill will be reintroduced. We think it has a good chance of passage, especially now that it's a non-election year. And for those folks who want to get involved, in 2 slides, we'll let you know how you can do that. And Louise, I'll pass it to you.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we want to do in Connecticut, but I also want to just recognize that we have people from Oregon, friends from Bend, Oregon, Pollinator Pathway, Vermont, Virginia, Arizona, Massachusetts, a lot of other states here. I probably missed some. And just invite everyone to recognize that if you want to start this in your town, in your state, that's what we're doing. So, you can do it. And if you want to get information from us, just contact us, info@pollinator-pathway.org, how to get started. I mean, the first step for all of us is to call our state representatives and let them know that we want action to restrict these pesticides. But just briefly, in Connecticut, last year, we did have a bill, and it had 2 parts. It had the neonic turf and ornamental aspect, since we don't have as much farming. We had modeled our bill on New Jersey's. And then we also had been fighting for years to ban chlorpyrifos from golf courses, where we know, due to amazing research by Tara Cook-Lippman, who I think is on tonight, who went to Hartford and looked through boxes and found out that 80% of that use was on golf courses. So that's what we have in Connecticut, and we know the same thing is happening with neonics, with imidacloprid, that it's being used on lawns and golf courses and business complexes. So our bill was to ban the chlorpyrifos and the neonics, and at the last minute, the neonics got just lopped off the bill, and the ban on chlorpyrifos on golf courses passed, which was great. But we saw a really huge resistance mounting from the chemical industry on the neonics part of our bill. So I just want to say that if you're out there, if you're from Connecticut, contact us and get involved. We have a coalition. We're working on new language for this year's bill. We are actually trying to raise money to hire a lobbyist. So if you want to donate, you can go to our website and donate and put in the note that it's for Pesticide Advocacy Fund for Connecticut. So that's our work, and we're going to do it this year. And I feel like if New York can do this, and Connecticut can do it. We need to just, start a wave. So yeah, that's the update. And I guess we're going to go to questions now. Lena.
Well,
right.
before we did, I just wanted to
Okay.
give the plug too for folks that want to get involved, for folks in the New York area that want to get involved. Please reach out to us, to Lena Faustel, who's helping us in the campaign. We'd really love to get in touch. I will echo Louise's sentiments that if there's one thing that you can do, especially if you live in New York State, it's call your state legislators. They really take notice. I mean, an email is great. And they take notice of that too. But when somebody takes the time to call the office of their state legislator, they track that, believe me. And we hear about it when we're in meetings with them. We hear if people have been calling or if they haven't. And just to give folks a sense of what sort of things they can get involved with. And just to give you a sense of the time frame. So the new legislative session in New York and Connecticut starts in January. And those sessions, I actually don't know the Connecticut session, but the New York session runs through about mid-June. So that's our window of action. And during that period, we're going to have an electronic petition. Again, calling your legislators is always helpful whenever. We're trying to get as many groups into the coalition as we possibly can. We're going to have lobby days, social media opportunities. So again, if you are interested, if you live in New York, and you're interested in getting involved in the New York campaign, please reach out to us. And if you live in Connecticut and are interested in getting the Connecticut campaign, please reach out to that email address.
And if you're anywhere else and you want to get involved, you can also email me or info@pollinatorpathway.org. And I wanted to just add that Lena and Dan put together a script. So if you do want to get up the nerve to call your rep, it's on our website, Pollinator Pathway website, and probably, I don't know, maybe that's the best place for people to find it, but a script for an email or a call to make it easier.
Yeah, and I can always pass it along too if somebody reaches out to me. So
yeah, maybe if we do a mailing of the recording of this to everyone who signed up, we could just send a link to where that information is.
Sure thing.
Yeah, you don't have to fly blind. Okay, so I think with that we can go to questions, and I'll stop my share.
Okay, so we do have quite a few questions, and I think we have about 20 minutes, so we'll get to as many as we can. So let's see. Looks like the first question, Dr. Nolan would like to answer. So it's let's see, the long one. Let me look through it for a second.
I think that one of the first questions coming in was about
So we're talking about trees,
soil
oh, yeah.
organisms and trees. And I wanted to answer it live because it's such a good question. All the research that I've been able to find shows that neonics kill every organism they've been tested on in the soil, including microorganisms, worms, various species of worms. So I have great fears that farmers who are using these seeds are sterilizing their soil. And that's one of the reasons we want to help with this. But farmers have been often working with their agricultural organizations and receiving information from the Chemical Society, believe that it's easier or better to use these seeds. And I compare that to using these neonicotinoid insecticides like prophylactically, and instead of using them if there's actually an infestation. And there's no evidence that using them before there's any infestation is helpful or saves money, but we haven't convinced enough farmers of that yet, but it seems to be the case. With tree applications, it's a little different. And there is evidence that certainly if you apply the neonics to the tree, it's going to go into the sap and it's going to pervade throughout the tree. The degree to which that hurts the environment depends upon how much shedding of those leaves there are, how many birds or other animals may be eating and then passing on the neonics. So in New York State, we have left in place an exclusion to allow treatment of trees for invasive species infestations, but with a lot of internal discussion among the groups who are advocating to control and regulate these products of whether we need to go further. And someone else asked in the chat why these seeds are still being all treated and why we just don't go back to regular seeds. The industry wants to sell this stuff. And I think they're also afraid that if we're successful in limiting the use, that will be the first step to limiting the use of other things. In New York State, we tried to make it clear that we just want to get rid of the most harmful, these seed treatments. But I think that the industry is seeing this as a battleground, and that they can't allow any even reasonable regulation, or it will lead to more reasonable regulation. Dan?
I think just to add on that from the farming side of things, you know, again, the uses that are targeted in the New York bill are just those that have been shown in study after study after study. And I'm talking studies in Canada, studies in Iowa. Now there's a group of studies that are emerging in New York. And what they find time after time after time, and this is thousands of field trials, is that these are not providing any net economic benefits. What they are doing, though, is they're hurting species that are important for farming. So let's remember that these pesticides are killing pollinators. And as it turns out, a lot of farming, especially in New York, relies on pollinators. And it's not just pollinating species. There are other insects that are beneficial to farming. So especially for organic farmers and regenerative farmers, they rely on beneficial insects to eat pest insects. And there's evidence that actually the neonics are much better at killing the good bugs than they are at killing the bad bugs, because the good bugs, so the pest predators, go around and they eat several of these other insects that have been contaminated, and they die. They don't reproduce as quickly. That's what sort of makes a pest, right? It's very good at reproducing and spreading itself very quickly. The pest predators, not so much. So we're losing those predators. We're losing pollinators. And as Kathy mentioned, and this is just sort of an emerging area, we're also seeing studies linking neonics to changes in soil health and impairment of soil health as well. And I think that's something that you're going to see more and more of down the line.
Great. And somebody also asked, does anyone know if the EPA is considering the ban of these chemicals?
Not realistically. No, they won't do that.
One of the difficulties is that we don't think that the EPA has even completely followed their own protocols for assessing the harmful effects and regulating under their existing laws. So we would like to see the EPA giving more attention to this and serving this purpose, but it really, I agree with Dan, I don't think that's realistic, and that's why we're asking states that can do more than what the federal government does to step in and fill the gap.
Dan, do you want to just mention, oh, sorry. Do you want to just mention what's happened in California? I think it helps to see the strength of the chemical industry. I mean, the veto.
Yeah, definitely. So, you know, similar to the New Jersey bill, there was a bill in the California legislature that addressed the non-agricultural uses. And California is a little different. The state pesticide agency there has actually crafted some new rules that's going to reduce neonic use in agriculture by about half. But the two donut holes there are sort of the two donut holes in the New York bill. They weren't looking at the non-ag uses, and they weren't looking at the treated seeds, which actually they don't regulate at all, which is kind of surprising. But that bill passed by very healthy margins in both the Assembly and the Senate in California. It was vetoed by Governor Newsom, unfortunately, we think for purely political reasons, and we don't have to get into that. But the silver lining there is that Newsom did order the state agency there to look at these non-agricultural uses. And that's not something that they were going to do unless we had passed that bill. So a small silver lining there, but it just goes to show, I mean, this is something that we had such phenomenal support from across the spectrum. And still, you know, the power of the chemical industry was able to defeat it at the end of the day.
Thanks, Dan. So we have a question from Constance asking, how can we get a copy of the Cornell report?
It's online. So it's a slim 430 pages. And I think half of that is just pages of footnotes. But I don't know the exact website offhand, but if you type in, you know, Cornell neonicotinoid report, you'll find it.
Yeah, I believe it's on Cornell University's website or their extension, one of their extension websites, but it'll come up with that simple search.
Great. Okay, so Patty asked, is it advisable to provide information to our local nurseries, including this webinar, to educate and request neonic-free plants?
I think that's a great idea. The more we can educate people who will be asked questions about these chemicals, the more we have ambassadors. So I appreciate that question and think we should be doing that. There's also some other questions about whether neonics are being used for pre-treatment of trees and shrubs, and that it's been difficult to get an answer to that question. I have found that to be true as well. Even some growers do not know if they don't start from seedlings themselves. But I think asking the questions and getting those growers involved, and I don't know if any of the research particularly focused on trees and shrubs, but I can't believe that it's necessary to use these agents prophylactically there because it's not helpful anywhere else. There was another question about whether or not there is a setting in which to use neonics. And for me right now, that would be only in the treatment of, to reduce the spread of invasive diseases that are themselves very harmful to trees, like the hemlock woolly adelgid. And as I said earlier, I think even that is worrisome and should be done within strict protocols, very limited areas before and studied then to make sure we're not harming the ecosystem more than the death of the hemlocks would.
And just to add a point on the nursery point, so while we don't have exact numbers, I think it's sort of common wisdom that neonics are very common in nursery production. And that's because they want these plants to look perfect when they are on those, you know, at Home Depot or at your garden store. You know, they want them to be spotless because that's what people want to plant in their backyard. You know, that's an economic incentive that they have. But if there are enough people asking about pesticides, asking about neonics, then those incentives change, right? Because those owners think, oh, people care more about whether this plant contains pesticides, contains neonics, than if it's absolutely 100% perfect. So yeah, I think it's always helpful to do that.
Dan, would you also talk a little bit about which companies are behind the neonics and why you can't get untreated seed in the United States?
Yeah, so that's a big one. So the original companies to make neonics were some of the big agricultural companies. I think Bayer was the first. And all of the neonics are off patent now. So they're actually produced by all sorts of people. It's not just the big folks. But the reason they're so prevalent on these corn and soybean seeds, despite the fact that, you know, they're shown to be not terribly effective, is that there are only about 3 or 4 seed companies that make sort of the most desirable genetically modified corn seeds that farmers want to plant. And if you buy corn seeds from those folks, it comes with a neonic standard. You don't have a choice. You can't say, well, I want this on my seed. I don't want this on my seed. It just comes. And that's a problem with sort of the monopoly power or the oligopoly power of these big seed and chemical corporations, because it's the seed companies. Right now we have a situation. It used to be that the seed companies and the chemical companies were separate. Now the companies that make the chemicals are also the companies that make the seeds. And in the past few years, that consolidation at the top has only gotten worse. So it is a problem with monopoly control. But what we saw in Canada is once Quebec and Ontario started to make rules that changed the system, that put the restrictions on, we saw that market entirely flip. And I think it just takes that small push in New York, and I think and other places in the country. I think if you see that push in New York, that's something that's going to ripple through markets nationwide.
Great. Okay. So we have a question from Roberta. Says, I'm in Connecticut. Will this bill ban imidacloprid and my dog's tick topical?
No. Yeah, it does not go after veterinary uses.
But
All right,
so we have there are important issues
from
there.
Russ. I seem to recall that there is some sort of effort to boycott some retailers who routinely apply neonics to some of the seeds and plants they sell. I believe that big box retail stores are among the guilty culprits for this. Could you point us to more info on these campaigns?
So
I think the questioner may be talking more about some of the campaigns to limit herbicides like glyphosates that kill plants, and they are terribly toxic. They do not go systemically into plants, and well, they can be injected systemically, but they are not being used in quite the same way. And they have their own campaigns that are complementary to what we're doing with neonics, but different pharmacology and different kind of impacts, and they're used in different places. Like along the side of the roads to control weeds from growing onto pavement. Dan, you have thoughts on that?
yeah, and I think there was also a campaign from Friends of the Earth. We participated in a bit, and I'm not sure what's happening with it now, but it's the Gardeners Beware campaign, where they tried to get big box stores to swear off neonics and maybe some other pesticides. And they sort of gave them it wasn't a boycott, but they gave them sort of grades, right, in terms of how well they were doing with it and what commitments they made. And I know a number of retailers made commitments. I'm not sure how much follow through there's been on that. And, you know, it's sometimes difficult for some of these retailers too, because they may be sourcing these plants from other suppliers. And again, the pressure on that industry, and it's understandable, is that people want to buy perfect plants. And so I think the solution there is once people get educated enough and they demand, once the market demands neonic-free plants, pesticide-free plants, that's going to be the real shift in the markets there.
If I could go back just a second, the question about tick collars and tick applications for animals. Some very, very serious, thousands of very, very serious effects from imidacloprid and other agents in tick collars have been filed with the FDA, I believe it. No, not the FDA. Who regulates that? With the federal organization that regulates tick collars. And that has not been banned yet. I believe that is another mammalian impact from neonics, but because the neonics are with other chemicals, we can't really tease it out as cleanly. But I caution strongly against using those. Choose other products at this point. And I have it on my list to maybe move on to that if we can get rid of the larger impact of neonics getting into our water and our food.
And I think for folks interested in learning more of the impacts there, USA Today did a really good article on this. I think it was about a year ago. a number of instances, I think well over 1,000 reports of these pet collars, causing problems with pets, and I think in a number of instances death as well. So I would look for that article if you're concerned about that.
Yeah, Google Seresta. It's the Seresta collars that have been
Right.
the focus of it.
Yeah.
Great. Looks like we only have about a minute left. We have a question from Donna who said, is there any situation in which neonics are the treatment of choice?
Well, I think Kathy pointed it out. It's with invasive species in these woody plants. If you can say one thing about neonics is that they really do kill stuff. And that includes invasive species. And right now, and this is something that came out in the Cornell report too. And that's why, we feel so confident in this bill is it really follows the contours of that report. And one thing the report says is, if you want to battle hemlock woolly adelgid, you're going to want to use neonics. And so the bill exempts that. But again, I think, as we move further into the future, hopefully other treatments will emerge because, as Kathy mentioned, it's not problem free, those treatments, but right now that appears to be the best available alternative.
There is one more good question. It would be for you, Kathy. Are there specific tests people can have done to see if these chemicals are affecting their health?
There are specific tests that can be done to know whether or not the chemicals are in a person's body. And the higher the level of the chemical, the more concern. But the studies are preliminary in the sense that we don't have a test that says, if you have this condition, then it's caused by the neonic exposure. It would be more kind of a correlation in any given individual. But if a person has a reason to think that they have very high exposures and they have any of the conditions that are seen in animals, or they're just worried about environmental exposure, then an environmental health clinician would be able to help try to sort that out. There's no single test at present, and no single condition that we can say, oh, if you have that, it was caused by the neonics, like we did have with thalidomide and a certain type of congenital malformation. The congenital malformations that we've seen in deer and other animals with neonics are similar to malformations that can be caused by other things or that were present in our world before neonics came in. So it's not a one-to-one at this stage.
Can it be filtered out of water? Is it, I mean, I remember that Long Island water information.
Yeah, so granular active carbon filtration does remove neonics from water supplies. The problem is most water supplies do not use that filtration, especially in New York. There's a concern because both New York City and Syracuse have famously unfiltered water supplies. So they do use that chlorination treatment. They don't use any form of filtration. So those you would assume to be higher risk. Again, Long Island folks who are pulling their water from groundwater and it's not going through filtration. I know on Long Island, since there's been such a concern for pesticide contamination over the years, I would assume some of those water systems use granular active carbon filtration. But certainly the users that are at home that are not going through those water systems and pulling directly from the aquifer, that would be a risk. I will say one more thing: very few water systems test for neonics. It's just not something that's on their protocol of tests. But Long Island does, because they know it's in their water, or at least Suffolk County does. And we do see neonics show up in some of the larger water districts in Suffolk, actually at the tap.
And we should let folks know that organic foods, eating organic foods has been correlated with having lower levels of neonics in the body. So if people are able to filter their water and eat organic foods, it is possible to avoid the most exposure. But there are environmental justice issues that are raised with that, because it shouldn't be that people who can afford to eat organic and have, install a water filter on their plumbing are able to avoid this risk and other families are not able to avoid it. So this is a risk that we should remove from the environment because nobody should be exposed to it.
And as the Buckley study shows, I mean, the CDC data, but also the recent study, the Buckley study on 170 pregnant women, maybe we're not doing a very good job of avoiding neonics as a population. It's showing up in 90+% of pregnant women tested. And these women were from across the country. So, yeah.
And the question about, is there any good use? Right now, I would be satisfied if we just stopped the irrational, useless uses. If somebody were going to use a neonic to treat a crop pest on an agricultural field, and they did that, that would only amount to less than a few percentages of all the fields in New York, and I presume around the rest of the country. Somebody asked about Pennsylvania, probably there too. But using these chemicals where they're not needed is how we're getting such high concentrations and such ubiquitous exposure. So let's stop using it everywhere where it makes no sense. And then we can talk about whether or not we have to get rid of uses that somebody is treating something that's actually infecting a crop or one of our wild forest or protected forest areas. We could just be a lot smarter about this.
Can I answer one more question? I'd see a question about, is there a list of growers not using neonics? And the Pollinator Pathway, we do have a list of, they're regional, they're mostly around New York and Connecticut, Massachusetts, but we're always adding to that list. So if you are concerned and you call your local nursery and you ask all the questions and you shop there and you find out that they are pesticide free, let us know and we'll add them to that list.
It's worth noting too that organic producers can't use neonics. So if it's certified organic, it shouldn't have neonics in it, although some organic produce does, because again, they're in the environment, they sort of bleed into organic fields, but usually the levels are much lower. And in most cases, organic produce should not have neonics in it.
Often also nurseries and growers that focus on native plants and species will also avoid neonics and other insecticides and herbicides. So that's not a universal, but it can be a place to start if you're looking to buy some shrubbery and want to try to avoid these products.
And always ask, because we have to show that there's a market for, pesticide-free nursery plants.
Absolutely.
There are a lot of questions still unanswered. Maybe we can follow up with answers to some of these if we can save the chat.
Totally.
Yeah, definitely. And some folks are asking if we can email out the list of those places, which we can, share when we share the recording as well. So definitely can answer some of these questions afterwards.
I guess are we wrapping up here? Thank you everybody for coming. You guys, thank you for the talk. I mean, every time I hear it, I'm more energized and ready to get out there, do this work. And thank you for being a resource for us at the Pollinator Pathway. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Louise, for having us today, and thank you everyone for joining.
Yeah, these were wonderful questions, and really glad to have you host this and spread the word. Thank you.
Call your representatives. Bye.
Bye, everyone.